Hello, and welcome back to the Empower Nutrition Podcast. I just cannot wait for this conversation that I'm going to have today with Deirdre, who's a registered dietitian who really specializes in childhood obesity. And I already have so many questions I want to ask you, but welcome to the show, Deirdre.
Oh, thank you so much, Erin. I'm so happy to be here with you and your listeners. So thank you for inviting me.
Oh, absolutely. And I do think that, one thing I always say with working with children is that technically as a dietitian, you don't need to be a parent, but I saw that you have children. I have 3 children. I know that working with children in that setting, maybe not even as a parent, but if you work as a nanny or in a child care facility and you actually day to day are involved in child feeding, I think that brings a whole new level of understanding to
a whole new level, and the T-shirt that says "Do as I say, not as I do."
Yeah,
because we're human, and it's really it's a journey raising healthy and confident eaters, and it does not happen. And spoiler alert, it doesn't happen in preschool.
Absolutely.
It is a lifelong journey that most of us are still on, and we will probably always be on. But so my passion is childhood obesity, primary prevention, and mitigating, and one day reversing it. So that's really kind of where my 20-year career has landed me. Along the way.
Well, what really strikes me is that this is such an epidemic. And we were just talking offline about childhood obesity, even since I was a child. I don't want to say, but it was like in the 80s. Even since then, it's a dramatically different incidence of this, and so it is kind of fascinating to me that I don't know that I've ever met a dietitian who's actually solely focused on childhood obesity. Like, what's up with that?
So no, so I grew up in the 70s, so I have you beat. 70s into the 80s, and I had obesity. I was the 1 in 20 children that was the standout. So I think those early rooted memories, of course, early childhood experiences tend to guide our direction often in life. And there's no doubt that it had a really profound effect on me. Not because at the time full disclosure, not because I wanted to save the world and rid the world of childhood obesity, but truly my own curiosity. Because as a child, I was at Weight Watchers when I was 7 years old. Don't judge my mom. It was the 70s.
It was the time to do that. Yeah.
But I was so perplexed by why, something, for me, it was something like ice cream, why it had such a powerful control over my behaviors. And regardless of my goals and my intentions, it seemed to override that. So that was just a curiosity and something that I just wanted to figure out. And so it led me to a career path in dietetics. And as we were talking earlier, I graduated with tons of knowledge, but I was still missing those answers of the why, the why behind our eating behaviors. I could tell you what's healthier, blindfolded. So could you. But it really was what drives human behavior.
Absolutely.
And why is this epidemic getting worse? And so, of course, that segued into 20 years of being an independent researcher and really studying the brain, evolutionary biology, which I know we're going to jump into later, which I can't wait to. And really a better understanding. And in doing so, during this period, I was raising my own children. I was observing all of these pitfalls that are set up for parents to fail right from the get-go. And, concerned with my own kids, because again, I've come from a family with obesity, very prevalent, in trying not to be a parent that talked about weight or anything like that, but yet still trying to guide my kids in the direction of healthy eating habits. Now, fortunately, they inherited their father's genetics, but because my kids are fortunately, for the most part, they've never really had a problem with their weight. But in today's day and age, that 1 in 20 is now, 1 in 3 almost. It's between 1 in 3 and 1 in 4 kids. And that's crazy. And that happened in not that long, 40 years. So there's something going on that is definitely more than, environment. It's definitely more than, obviously our genome hasn't changed in, 50 years. And that really is what drove me into this space of research of early development origins of health and disease, or fetal programming, metabolic programming, and the realization that primary prevention actually starts in pregnancy, in that whole perinatal period. And so that's what I'd love to chat with you today about.
Yeah, so maybe let's start with, I guess so, like, here's the premise with people's thinking around adult or childhood obesity. I think there's this kind of simplistic thinking of like, hey, this is an energy intake versus output problem. And so when they look at an adult, there's this, so I would say, like, toxic, poorly informed thinking of like that person just kind of needs to like get it together and like have more self-control. And then with kids, there's this even more harmful, toxic thinking around like, yeah, that parent doesn't take care of their kids properly and the kid needs to get it together, and that's even more harmful. And so obviously you and I both have a deeper understanding that there's a lot more going on here than just a way that I always explain this is like, look, you think that your mind is in control of how much you eat and what you eat, but really it's the signaling of your body that is in control and dictating what you do. It's overriding what you want, what you've decided in your brain that you think you should do, and you aren't actually in control in the way you think. So it's a matter of the physiology that's happening. But maybe tell me a little bit more about what you said about like some of the ways that parents are sort of like set up to fail from the beginning. Like, what do you mean by
gosh, yeah. Parents are, and I work with parents. I do some work with children, but primarily I prefer to work with parents because here's the thing: we inherit our habits and our behaviors. They're taught to us and handed down. We may change them or tweak them, and we follow the advice of what's on the TV, and there's really no standardization of how to eat or education of really how our bodies respond to food. So we have parents, and myself included, trust me, even being a dietitian and with my level of knowledge, nobody is perfect. We are all driven by our biology. It's really the key, though, is understanding our biology. And that's something they don't teach in schools. It's something that is so crucial to understand because it's like driving a car. I mean, we wouldn't put anyone behind the wheel of a car unless they knew how to drive it. Yet we have this crazy biology that's hardwired from, hundreds of thousands, if not millions of years ago, to survive in a far different food environment than what we're living in right now. And it's affected every system in our bodies. And it's basically what they call an evolutionary mismatch. We've got tons of them now where these, once advantageous traits have completely backfired in today's, land of plenty, if you will.
Yeah. So it sounds like maybe what you're saying is that parents are told to feed their children like healthy foods from our modern diets, but even our healthy version of our modern diet is still a mismatch with like human physiology. Is that what you mean?
Exactly. Well, that's a different mismatch, but that's a good segue because I know I kind of went down a little rabbit hole over there. But yeah, so that's another contributor to consumer confusion is food marketing. Food makers and marketers are really given a lot of leeway on how they can educate the public, and that's another challenge that we have is just so much information, a lot of misleading packaging and whatnot, and most of these foods are ultra processed anyway, so that's a whole other conversation. But so parents don't have it easy, and what people have to understand too is that 75% of parents struggle with their own weight. So it is a real complicated, complex system of inheritance and with all of these, nuances in between, such as, genetics and environment and, and behavior and all that good stuff. But primary prevention, but there is, we were saying this earlier, we need a system, and we lack a system. We don't have a system of intervention with children right now. Primary prevention, which is defined as, preventing something before symptoms even appear. Our current paradigm of intervention is really, intervention starts when that BMI triggers overweight or obesity, or another indicator, but it's usually physical, or it could be, biochemical. But it's at that point, your prevention is off the table for the most part. Now we're managing, we're mitigating, and it's really hard to do that with children. It's so hard to do that with children. It's so hard for parents. It's nearly impossible for pediatricians. They don't have, really, unfortunately, they just don't have the time. And it's in obviously dietitians are underutilized. I'd love to see more of, more dietitians in the pediatric space, because it really is an all hands on deck situation. This is a serious crisis, and COVID blew it up, made it even worse. So there is a window though where we can intervene, and it's supported by 2 decades worth of solid science and research, and that is these early formative crucial windows of development. And basically what mom's eating. And I don't want to put all the pressure on mom, because I was pregnant twice, once with twins and once with my daughter. My last pregnancy was almost 18 years ago. So trust me when I say I read all this research cringing and saying, oh my God, I'm sorry guys. But if I knew this information, you believe me, I would have done things so much different. I mean, I didn't go crazy, but there's just so much information to understand and to learn from. And there's so much that can be reset, believe it or not, reset in pregnancy. And I will go out on a limb and say that. Genetics, our DNA is still there, but during these crucial windows of development, when programming is taking place, and that program is typically, stick with metabolic programming, and this is really key, because we have genes that we flip switches on genes during these critical years of like, how are they going to function? That's epigenetics. So based on the feedback that is coming in from the outside environment, and this is where it goes back to evolutionary biology, and we evolved with a brilliant system of trying to increase the chances of survival of that unborn baby, which was, passing genes on to the next generation was the ultimate goal of evolution. We evolved all these systems to increase those chances. And a lot of them take place in pregnancy. And people really don't understand it, but information from the outside world, information that comes in through mom's diet, or mom's diet and lifestyle, really, and it goes into that embryo, that intrauterine environment, which is really like a big classroom for the programming of that embryo systems. A lot of brain systems, a lot of metabolic and organs and things like that. So it's pretty incredible when you think about it, that what you're eating. So if you're in there's studies that support all of this, like a high fat diet, there's a lot of kind of fallout with that, in terms of programming, because it creates inflammation, and that interferes with programming of things like appetite, and hunger, and those hunger and the satiety hormones. And so it's just it's a really fascinating area of research, and I think we know enough, and we have enough solid evidence that we should be intervening.
Yeah. So I mean, one thing that is so important to highlight about what you're saying is that you have your genetics that are unchangeable, of like what your chromosomes say, from your parents. But there's this whole other layer to that that's epigenomics, which basically means that your environment can impact what parts of your genetic profile are expressed versus not expressed, and that ends up being what actually physically happens. And it sounds like what you're saying is that the mom's diet during pregnancy has a pretty powerful impact on that genetic expression in a way that can either promote versus reduce risk of childhood obesity. Is that right?
That's right. In terms of preventing, in terms of prevention in the fact that you're not creating those risks. So let me kind of clarify that a little bit. So, so overnutrition in pregnancy, your fetus you're literally eating for two, because what mom is eating, her fetus is also, metabolizing. And based on all that input, energy input, the nutrient input, it's programming how it's going to survive in the outside world. It's how we evolved to survive. So back then, though, the risk was never overnutrition. It was always undernutrition. So if a baby, back in the caveman days, a developing fetus was getting all of this input from the mother's diet, was this an energy dense environment that it was going to be born into? Well, there's ways to understand that and know that. So perhaps metabolism was then, designed to be conservative. So, you're lowering that their basal metabolic rate. And that served them well in that they're able to hang on to their fat stores longer in that environment. That's completely, it has backfired in our current environment. And there are some human studies that have demonstrated that. But the same applies with overnutrition. And for years, the focus was always on, undernutrition. But there's no other way to describe or to explain, the rise in obesity rates in such a short period of time if it's not through metabolic programming.
Yeah, totally. So what it sounds like you're saying is that there's some sensing that happens in utero in a way where it's like if there's an excess of basically just energy intake, then there's this sort of set point that the baby has where it's going to be where it's more likely to accumulate energy. That doesn't make sense to me though, because wouldn't it be that like the opposite, where it's like if there's undernutrition in pregnancy, in fact, I think I've even seen research like this, then you're going to be where you're more conservative with energy and more likely to gain weight.
Yes, and you would think that it would. There's a lot of these, contradictory, biological phenomenons. But again, we are hardwired still for a whole different food environment and for a whole different risk. And it's going to be a while before this changes. I think our next systems update is like 700,000 years. So we got a ways to go. But because with overnutrition in pregnancy, what we see is kind of the opposite. So the placenta kind of, takes the incoming energy and sort of decides what to do with it. And with that is, increasing fat cells. Again, fat storage was always the ultimate goal. So we see that there's a really fascinating study that came out just earlier this year out of Oxford, where they were able to kind of pinpoint the 5th month as that tipping point where a high fat diet, a mom's high fat diet actually increased abdominal growth in that developing fetus or infant at that point, I think. And the trajectory went well into childhood. So in other words, at the time of birth, that growth remained. It stayed steady. It's pretty fascinating because that's second trimester. And that's where the challenge is.
Yeah, I mean, I think you have to be careful with that in the sense of like, we know that when you see a high fat diet in like a cohort, because fat has been historically so discouraged, you're going to actually generally have people who are also not being careful with like quality of carbohydrates, of like high glycemic versus not, and like quality of how much protein they're getting and processed foods and things like that. And so is it the fat necessarily? Because you probably are pretty careful about recommending a low fat diet to a pregnant woman. Is it really the fat, or do you think it's more just that fat is like a proxy for like a less quality, like more processed diet. What do you think on that?
For sure. No, fat's very important. So I mean, I'd never recommend a low fat diet to anybody. But this is more or less a high fat, high calorie, high energy diet. Of ultra processed foods. I'm sure they're not, it wasn't high fat from avocados, but what happens, what I think what happens there though is it's that connection with the microbiome and, and inflammation. And I think that's what triggers, what we're seeing here. But but anyway, so the baby will adapt by increasing storage capacity, and those are their cells for life.
I guess it kind of reminds me of maybe it's a different mechanism or even the same, but when you have like gestational diabetes, and that infant's going to have a higher obesity risk in childhood. I'm glad you brought up the microbiome, because I don't think it's very mysterious that like there's childhood obesity in the context of like a modern processed diet. Like it's so dramatically different than the natural human diet. To me, like the real mystery is like what happened. So like in 1980s, let's look at the 1980s or even the 70s. We were already on a pretty processed, this is like post-industrial revolution. There's already a lot of white flour. There's already a lot of white sugar happening. There was definitely like trashy little snacks in everybody's school lunch back then. And still it was a 1 to 20 ratio. So I think that's like really the most fascinating question in this is like, what's happened in the last 30 or 40 years that has made this epidemic really skyrocket? Because it hasn't been a switch from an ancestral diet to a modern processed diet. Like that had already happened. Like, what do you think?
Right. Again, I think there's a combination of different factors. Ultra processed foods, there's much more of them now. They're made differently. I mean, when I was growing up, processed foods were like Twinkies. we didn't have this whole other category of ultra processed food. Now processed foods are things like, I don't know, something that is pretty healthy, but it's somewhat, it's got some water and salt added to it. Ultra processed foods today, though, there's a lot of chemicals, and there's like a lot of weird things like emulsifiers that definitely affect our signaling, our gut signaling. And I do think a lot of it comes down to the microbiome. I think, we're right on the verge of this huge explosion of real knowledge in how important our microbiota is and how it serves every function of our health, every organ system, every part of it. And how an ultra processed diet, which by the way, 71% of our kids and our adolescents, 71% of our kids' daily calories come from ultra processed foods. And what we were talking about earlier with nutrition mismatch, our bodies are very smart. Our gut knows the difference between, say, sugar or cane sugar and a packet of stevia, or no, sorry, that's about equal, or artificial sweeteners. All these things do eventually catch up, and it makes us hungrier. So I think that with the ultra processed foods, we have a lot of that going on. We have a lot of confusion, nutrient confusion, and we're not feeding our microbes. We're not supporting those good microbes, and because they're not getting what they need, and that's things like butyric acid from fermentation of certain vegetables and grains and whatnot, they're living off of that mucosal lining in our gut. And as you know, it doesn't take long before that becomes porous and we get in a situation of leaky gut. So I think, there's definitely a duality between the obesity epidemic and in this epidemic of mental health with our children as well, because that leaky gut and that systemic inflammation also affects a lot of our brain chemistry and our children's brain chemistry. So it's we've got a lot of work to do.
It's scary because we know that has been more, the problems with gut health has been more on the timeline we're talking about. And like, what's scary to me is that, whereas like with genetics that are like preserved, and then you can get kind of like a little fresh start with epigenetics, like during your fresh pregnancy, and like eating the right way and doing that. The microbiome's not like that. We're losing diversity each generation, and you're inheriting it from your mom when you're born, if you even get to have a vaginal birth. And then it's just, it's this like, there's not really a known way of like getting that back in this, any real way. I mean, of course there's prebiotics, of course there's eating high fiber and fiber diversity are all supportive of gut health. But like, if a species is gone, it's gone. You're not getting that back. And so to me, that's like the scariest thing about this. Is I'm with you that I think a huge amount of this has to do with the way that gut health impacts intestinal permeability and systemic inflammation, like metabolic endotoxemia. And I think that's happening in
it's
kids.
Happening younger and younger.
The way it is with adults. And I'm not sure, I mean, I don't mean to be depressing, but it's like, it's hard to know what to tell a parent about that. For me,
well, I look at pregnancy, I really do, as a reset button, and you know, for moms to be out there who are like, oh my God, you know, this is not, don't freak out, don't worry, trust me, you know, we all survived, you know, pregnancies of the 60s.
If we were probably having like cocktails and cigarettes for lunch.
Totally. Don't drink too much where you'll fall down and hurt the baby. Like, that was the advice.
Oh my God. I should laugh. That's
so I think we're still looking okay. So but I was going to get into that second trimester, and this is really fascinating. And this is really what I work with a lot of pregnant women on. Is and you'll appreciate this. You probably are well versed in it with ancestral nutrition. I talked about some of these evolutionary sort of advantages that are still hardwired in us, and there's so many in pregnancy. Even morning sickness, believe it or not, is an advantage of, you know, avoiding toxic meats and, you know, microbes and things like that. But in the second trimester, now, you know, keeping in mind that back then, you know, women were in a natural environment. It was, you know, feast or famine, but usually feast. Food had to be found and, you know, hunted for. So the goal was to store as much energy as possible, because to support the growth of the baby in that last trimester, and then delivery, and then breastfeeding. So that's a lot of energy that, you know, mom had to find in the wild to ensure, again, the ultimate goal is to, you know, give birth to that baby who will then pass his or her genes on to that next generation. So in that second trimester, we're preset with a starvation response. So I don't know, you know, in my pregnancy, I know all about that. Believe me, it was the craziest appetite, and I was carrying twins. You know, I didn't know all this information, and let's just say I kind of was like, oh, I'll just lose it after. And I gained a lot of weight, but it was really, really easy to do it, because we're designed when we're in that sort of, I call it a starvation mode, but everything's engaged. We've got, you know, ghrelin is firing off 24/7. It's engaging with the brain with dopamine and that whole cascade of you know, wanting and finding and over consuming, and not just, you know, healthy things, because, you know, now we have competition with berries and you know, fish and nuts. We now have, you know, too much food. So that's a challenge. So when we have overweight women, or women that enter into pregnancy with obesity, it's okay. I mean, you don't have to worry because you have obesity that you're going to necessarily pass that along to your child. It's not really how it works. You know, obesity is inherited, just unfortunately, through these epigenetic mechanisms most of the time. And it's through, again, you know, kind of going through pregnancy and not understanding how our physiology is adjusting to meet the needs of an environment that we no longer are living in, and how it's now affecting, you know, not just our you know, our lives, but the future health of our babies. So, you know, even as powerful as those systems are, they can be overridden by a greater desire, and that is, you know, carrying a healthy baby, or making healthier choices. So I work with parents, and the dad's involved too, because he's got some skin in the game too. His behaviors are going to also impact those crucial developmental programming after birth. So the first 1,000 days of birth, they say, is when all the key programming happens, from conception right up until the 3rd birthday. And if you think about it, that's like the most challenging period of feeding children. Up to you've got the terrible twos, you've got food neophobia, you've got autonomy in play. So we take it, we chunk it out. That's what what my company did, Nutrition Nanny. We start, and it's a gradual continuum. If you jump on on this journey late in the game, it's never too late. That's the great thing, and that's the amazing thing about our metabolisms, is that it's never too late. It's never too late to maybe too late to change the programming, but it's never too late to change your lifestyle, your environment. I do a huge emphasis on that.
Yeah. Well, let me ask you this. I mean, we keep dancing around this, but let's say you have a client who's pregnant. I think the world is basically telling her, look, just avoid the things that are going to give you listeria, and take a prenatal vitamin, and you do you. Tell me what you I'm just curious to hear what you would recommend that she eat.
Well, it's so funny, because that's what we're still given. I mean, there's some OBGYNs that really get into nutrition, and they do supplemental programs, which is amazing. And this research it's not like nobody knows about it. So it is being practiced. But for the most part, you're getting lists of what not to eat, what to avoid, troubleshooting, things like that. But with anything else, every single pregnancy journey is going to be different. So I have moms that I work with that have, they have, I'm drawing a total blank on it, hyperemesis throughout pregnancy, where they never lose that morning sickness.
Yeah.
So we have to work around that. I have clients that, most of my clients I work with already have obesity. So we work on managing a steady weight, and with appropriate weight gains, which isn't a lot. Also on healthy choices, and starting the process of changing your own food preferences and eating habits, because it's going to come into play after that baby comes home. They're going to see what you're eating, they're going to want what you're eating, and that food environment that they're going to grow up in is really going to be a huge deciding factor on their future preferences, eating habits, and even on their weight status.
Okay. So if we're thinking about the epigenomics of this, and considering the ancestral lens, are you going so far with pregnant women to recommend that they don't eat more modern foods, for example, grains, and are you telling them to go grain free or dairy free or legume free or vegetable oil free?
No.
Or are you saying just go more government guidelines healthy diet? What do you mean by eat healthy?
Well, first of all, you always have to meet your clients where they're at. And if somebody comes in and they're used to eating, fast food every day, we have to start there, because they're not going to start eating, especially pregnant. They're not going to start adopting these unrealistic lifestyle changes when they've got so much going on, because in pregnancy, there's so much going on. You're exhausted. Many times you're juggling, other children, a spouse, 1 or 2 jobs. So it has to be super realistic.
Of course. But let's say I'm look, Deirdre, I want to pay you $1 million. I want to optimize my child's risk of childhood obesity. I'll do whatever you say. And I have all the time in the world, and I have zero stress. What would you tell me to eat?
Well, then I would obviously do some calculations on, what she needs, taking her current nutritional intake, based on that, but also just making sure that she's eating enough protein, enough healthy fats, enough fiber, complex carbohydrates. So she's getting her micronutrition in. And minimizing that highly processed food. And, I'm not saying that you can't indulge in cravings because, come on, it's pregnancy and you want to enjoy pregnancy. But during those crucial windows, it's, it's important that you're eating, optimal nutrition. Quality and quantity definitely matter. So it's really just about making sure that weight gains are appropriate. Hunger, and especially in that second trimester, that's where we really work to kind of help sort of mitigate the hunger and the cravings. And we do that through like nutrient composition, slightly higher in protein, lower in sugars, not complex carbs, of course, but more like processed foods that trigger that, meal spacing, things like that, just to help. Again, can't really do much other than that during pregnancy, but just optimizing nutrition and trying to, mitigate those pregnancy hormones that are really kind of creating that starvation response.
Okay. And then what about, well, I don't know if you feel like this is a thing, but I think that there's such a unfortunate sort of moment right now with child feeding where it's almost like there's been this pendulum swing where it used to be very like structured, where kids just had to eat whatever the parents said. They had to finish their plate. I'm talking more like, the 50s, 60s, 70s.
Yeah.
It's all force feeding and like no choice. And then and of course that's harmful and not healthy.
Right.
But then now I feel like there's this sort of moment where it's like, no pressure, let them pick whatever they want. Don't make them eat anything. Don't let them make them try anything. It's just kind of like, let your kid intuitively eat from whatever choices are around. And
yeah, well, that's the key right there. Whatever choices are around.
Yeah.
I have such a different kind of school of thought on this because, I know the Ellen Sater method. I don't know if you're familiar with that, but so I mean that it's very effective for sure, but this came out in the 80s. So we had a different food environment then. We had different, epigenetic makeup. We had different microbiomes. And I think in today's world, we need a happy medium. I don't agree with putting dessert on a dinner plate. I just don't. I think those are incredibly formative years. We have a hard enough time trying to, not overstimulate our child's, palates, because the foods today are deliberately formulated and chemically concocted to hit that bliss point in the brain really fast.
Yeah.
And it's hard to go backwards from that, especially children, because again, we are hardwired and to prefer sugar and to seek it. And that's our biology. And so when we look at a child in that environment where they're getting into the 2-year-old phase, 18 months to 2 years old, what happens is, and again, you can have a great feeder who ate, his strained peas and his pureed spinach and
honeymoon ends.
But all of a sudden, as this toddling little, this little person, you put these before them like whole peas and some spinach, and they want nothing to do with it. And so historically, that's always been sort of passed off as, oh, he's picky, terrible choose, as a behavioral thing. What parents don't understand is that is actually it's biological, and it's one of those evolutionary sort of, these advantages that once really served us well. It's called food neophobia, and it means fear of new food. And it was very effective, I'm sure, in saving tons of toddlers from putting poisonous berries in their mouths. But in today's world, very fast-paced world, a no patience world, it's very challenging for parents because they don't understand what it is. So that's an important thing to understand, that by forcing your kid to have a bite, or the one bite club, or even, I don't even recommend putting it on their plate, because these are true fears. I mean, it's a legitimate fear. And what happens if anybody pushes any fear on us? It gets worse, and it could become an aversion. And we don't want our children forever turned off from these vegetables and things that they're afraid of. So what I work with parents on doing is making sure that they're eating them. And that's could be a real challenge. If you want your kids to have, grow into healthy eating habits, you really have to model that. There's really no other way, because they will watch what you're doing. That's how they learn the safety of those foods. And then, of course, there's a whole other approach to it. And it's, different, things, nuances at the table, and how to talk to, communicate with your child without creating a stressful dining experience. But
Okay. Can I ask you a clarifying question?
yes.
Okay. So you're saying if it's a food that they are not interested in eating, don't even put it on their plate. And then eventually you think they'll start eating it?
Yeah, if they express that they don't want it, they push it away, and it's like a hard no, I wouldn't keep pushing the issue. I'd wait till they, are slightly older. You could say, "Would you like some?" They say no, I wouldn't push the issue. Again, this is a lifelong journey of building. It's not going to happen by their 4th birthday where they're going to be salad eaters.
Yeah.
So we have to just sort of keep along that sort of continuum. Now, the whole intuitive eating comes into play. I understand it, and I understand the concept. I just think it could be slightly dangerous depending on the level of palatability of what's being served. So intuitive eating with, say, baked chicken, some vegetables, blah, 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 that I can see. But, that bliss point in the brain that, again, when you hit that, your brain does release those endogenous opioids. You get that feel good feeling, that blunts, satiation. You're wired to overeat. So that's why I say it's tricky. So if you're going to do intuitive eating, feeding with your child, really understand all of that, what goes into it, because I agree with the concept, and I think it's super important. And I think a lot of children, especially in today's busy world that's distracted, and kids are on tablets and they're not paying attention to their body's hunger and satiation cues, they're not regulating their appetite. They know stuffed as being, I've had enough, but that's overconsumption. So it is, it's an important, it's a very important practice, and I support it, but I support it in an all-knowing environment.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, this is a really deep thing, getting into child feeding, and it is so tricky because, like, in that scenario you're talking about, I'm curious what you think about research around like palate development, in terms of like children generally have to taste a food of like an average of 11 times to accept it. Like they don't really get that opportunity there. And like what I see with that real gentle feeding of like, don't even get it near them if they don't like it, is what happens is they don't, in my experience, broaden their palate at all. They continue to narrow and narrow and narrow and narrow because they're rejecting the foods that are those more nutrient dense ancestral foods. And then maybe part of it is just, I mean, I'm curious what you hear about this paradox, but like what happens if the child doesn't want to accept the chicken and the broccoli, but then now they're crying because they're hungry and they can't sleep because they're hungry. The parent gives them a bowl of cereal, off you go.
No, it's always important to have at least 2 items on that plate that your child will eat, and pairing it with, an introductory food or a second offering, a second introductory. Again, just keeping it as part of that food environment's normal, it's part of that food environment. Not to say, okay, Jimmy doesn't like, broccoli, so we're never going to bring it back in the house because we don't like it either. The goal is, if nobody likes broccoli, well, maybe it's, get creative with broccoli. Like that's, the amazing thing about humans is that we are, we can change our preferences. We eat a very diverse diet, and it's never too late to change a preference and to learn new, healthier eating habits and discard the old ones. But you mentioned preference learning, and I think this ties in really nice too with, again, during pregnancy. It's an amazing time to start that early, because in that intrauterine environment, even though the baby does not receive nutrition in the amniotic sac, it's still exposed to flavors from mom's diet. And again, this was another one of these evolutionary little hooks that you got that baby familiar with the flavors of the diet that it had to survive in on the other side once it, after birth. And it's, I mean, it's one of the ways, it's a part of the human condition of conditioning life, after birth. The problem today is that our kids, they're bathing and they're swimming in sugar, or what are we exposing them to? There's this really fascinating study out of Monell Institute back in I want to say it was the late 90s, early 2000s. It just recently came back up, but they've shown that moms who eat a lot of vegetables during her pregnancy, and then again in breastfeeding, because of the flavors transfer into the milk, they had babies who had an easier acceptance to those same vegetables later on, and during food introduction, period introduction. That's a great head start. And even if they go through that little bump in the road, that neophobia, where they're afraid of it, they're not afraid of the flavor. They're afraid of it because it's different. It's no longer pureed. It's now little peas, or blob of whatever, or chopped up carrots. That's what they're afraid of. They're just afraid to try it. But the rooted preference is already there. So it's so important to really look at pregnancy as an opportunity, like a big classroom of how you can impress your child's, not just their future health, but their eating habits. You can kind of try to get the terrible twos over in pregnancy.
Yeah. One last question, because I feel like I can't not ask you this, is along these lines of child feeding. It is just so tricky, like you said, with sugar, because it is everywhere, and we don't want to completely withhold all sugar. I think that's unhealthy. What do they do when they turn 18 and go to college? They don't know what to do. But obviously you don't want to just, and I've seen this, to say, that all food's fit, so I put a cookie on your dinner plate. What do you recommend for from maybe age 3 to 12 in that realm?
Moderation. I wrote a children's book on this. It's called The Very Hungry Cave Boy, and it talks about kind of our wiring and how this cave boy Joe had to walk tons of miles with his dad every day, and he had this craving for berries, and he found this berry bush, and he had planned to just eat a few and bring the rest back, but his brain kept saying, keep eating, don't stop. And how that helped Joe have enough energy for to walk 5 miles home, and then a little extra to store. And then it kind of jumped into a million years later, and then there was modern Danny with the same exact wiring but different foods and the same message, keep eating. It was like 2 jumbo cookies. I think it's so important, Erin, that kids as young as preschoolers start to understand how their bodies are wired. They need to understand, and there's nothing wrong with, if you want an apple or a cookie. I did a course in an elementary school where we did this whole thing on, nutrition and, how healthy fruits and vegetables are. And then that when I left, they had snack time, and they were given a choice between an apple and a brownie that was gluten-free, nut-free, dairy-free, everything free. And they all chose the brownie. And so when I came back the next day, I said, so who chose the apple? And I said, do you know why you didn't choose the apple? Because you weren't supposed to, to validate that they're wired to like sugar, and not to shame them because they don't understand their biology yet. But then to just, always talk to kids and have that conversation with them about making healthier choices. It's work, because our default is that higher bliss, trigger in the brain. So it's not easy. There's a lot of challenges in raising, keeping kids along that healthy habit building path. There's a lot of, drop off points, but you just can't give up. You got to just, pick back up and keep on going, because again, it is a lifelong journey. Yeah.
It is so challenging. I mean, I feel like it's almost unavoidable that you start to set up some food rules, but maybe it's not a bad thing to have some food rules around sugar.
Oh, I agree.
But that's a pretty controversial thing to say.
Well, I agree with schedules. I think schedules are super important, and routine. And I don't think there's anything wrong with with food rules in the house, no eating in your bedrooms, things like that. If you want a snack, you can just eat it at the kitchen table. You'll be amazed at how little, if they can't be in front of the TV, they're not getting that full sensory, effect. You can definitely create, if you want to say rules, or just, I call it structure, and we need it. Our kids need it.
Yeah. I think when you're in an environment that isn't consistent with your wiring, there's really no way than to have, like what you said, a structure to kind of protect against that in some way. But without, like, the trick is to not set up harmful thinking that's disordered and like shaming. So that's the trick.
It is, because that turns to hiding and shame and a whole different path altogether. And that's a lot harder to correct, believe me. So it's one of the first things I talk to moms during pregnancy about it. I educate them on how their baby's going to prefer these things and how to navigate that.
Yeah. Well, Deirdre, you are such a wealth of knowledge. I could just quiz you all day, but I know I have to let you go. And I'm sure people want to hear more about your practice and about your business. So maybe tell me a little bit more about Nutrition Nanny, of like what is available there if people want to learn more about, like what you said, primary prevention.
Yep. So Nutrition Nanny is a products and service-based platform that offers interventions during those critical periods of development, and which are all aimed at prevention, mitigating, and again, eventually reversing. And we work with pediatricians, mostly parents, but we've developed programs for pediatricians, because as much as parents are the agents of change, and I'd love to say, it comes down to parents, I think it puts a really unfair expectation on parents. I think parents will do anything to support their child's health. I mean, it's innate, but I just don't think it's fair to charge them with all of it, because they don't. A lot of parents don't have those skills, and they don't know themselves, and it's not their fault. We're not taught. So we need a total paradigm shift in multi-generation education. I think pediatricians, though, I think they really are the agents of change. They see children once a year. They have systems in place, but what they need, though, is nutrition systems that can give parents doable information and advice, and that's what we've developed, and that's what we're going to be bringing to that paradigm of prevention.
Awesome. So if there's a parent looking for help, where should they go to find out more about that?
They can go to www.nutritionnanny.com.
Great. Okay. Well, thank you, Deirdre.
Erin, this was great. I really enjoyed this. Yeah, we got to definitely talk again.
I feel like we just brushed the surface. It's so deep, but the work you're doing is so needed and so critical. So thank you for doing it and just coming on to spread the word and offer the amazing resources that you provide.
Oh, thank you so much, Erin, and take good care, and hope to speak to you soon.
You as well. Talk to you later.
All right. Bye-bye.